A question from Michael. Are you guys familiar with, I guess there's a movement, men going their own way?
Yeah.
Michael asks, what should a Christian view be of that movement, men going their own way?
Yeah, it's basically a modern counter movement to the whole. I don't know how many of you guys have the attention span or the mental fortitude to recall this, but when Roe versus Wade was being put away, as far as the Supreme Court was concerned in the United States, they did a sex strike where women said that, in rather explicit terms, we're not going to engage in physical relationships with men until we get our way in culture. Essentially, this is the same thing, but men are now doing it, and they're mocking them incessantly, referring to them as incels and other derogatory terms. But it's essentially an organized online abstinence movement, and saying because feminism, or more accurately, matriarchalism, is influencing culture in such a way where men are now starting to be discriminated against, both in legislation, like in court cases, and in other areas socially as well, that they're just going to commit to being their own authority. They are not going to submit to the sort of influences they believe that marriage will oppress them with, and just saying that we're not going to engage in those relationships and just live life the way that we want to. When it comes to a biblical, not only perspective of culture and the undoubted errors that are happening on all sides, but also just on the whole principle of abstinence in of itself. 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 1, is a perfect place to start. Paul, speaking to the church in Corinth, who had their share of gender issues, believe me, said, "Now concerning the things which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." That's what the movement essentially is saying. "Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does." This is where the feminists complain, but note as well, this is where the point balances out. "Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." Then it notes not to deprive one another, this is referring to physical relationships, "except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again," once again in reference to marital activities, "so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Noting this, but I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner, another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am," that is, single. "But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Then it goes on to note in addressing married couples. If we're in a culture where, and again, this is completely an empathetic point of view for both gender perspectives, when you ask, the classic song lyric, "Where have all the good men gone?" And likewise, men are asking, "Where are all the good men gone? I've been here this whole time and there's nothing paying off for it. Where have any decent women gone?" I say this in full irony between two married men. I myself am happily single. But when we're talking about this issue, understand that it's resolving a problem without actually dealing with the issue. If this movement's ultimate goal is to separate themselves for the purpose of not removing, but replacing priorities in their life, not for the approval of women, but for the pursuit of God, then all for it. Problem is that's not even remotely close to what this movement is about. It's entirely narcissistic, much like when women do the same thing. What we need to understand as Christians is that in whatever state I am called, to be content, in singleness or in marriage, that if, and this is what the chapter goes on to say, if you are loosed from a wife, do not seek a wife. If you have a wife, do not seek. I think I'm repeating myself, but you get the point. If you are married, don't seek to be loosed from the wife. If you don't have a wife, don't seek a wife, because both are ministries. Both give you an opportunity to honor God in different ways. If we look at this movement and say, well, I'm going to adopt the Little Rascals moniker of the He-Man woman haters. I think Three Stooges did it first, but nonetheless, the whole mindset of saying the best way for me to live my life is liberated from women. Or a woman is to say, I don't need no man. I'm a strong, independent woman. It's the same dumb attitude that's being echoed, just with a slightly different pitch, if you don't mind the gender-based humor. When we're talking about this issue, though, that's where you want to start in regards to your question. Remembering the name, Michael. Yeah.
Michael, yeah.
Michael, the one asked the question. 1 Corinthians 7, let that be your foundation as far as the relationship priorities we have. In marriage, the goal will be to get closer to Jesus. Outside of marriage, the goal will be to get closer to Jesus. How that's done is in different ways, but our priorities instead aren't to make sure that the woman's good to me or that the men conform to my idea of how society ought to be run. People in any position of power that they're given are going to abuse it, as we saw, but it's not a virtue in rebellion for its own sake. The idea should be, okay, no women in my life right now are following Jesus, so I'm going to be the exception. And who knows, the Lord might bring someone across your path that surprises you. But if on the other hand that doesn't happen, you haven't lost or gained anything that ministry wouldn't have fulfilled, just in a different way. Whether you're in my position, where you're single and content in that state, whether you're in Dave's position, where you're single and learning to be content in that state. I can't speak for you, but I'm sure you'd affirm.
But you did.
And of course, in Peter, where you have a marital relationship and you're honoring God where and how you can in that covenant. It's all the same goal. I don't see any other issue or any other problems or even any acronyms to describe that in an online community. If you run into people like this, just let them essentially get the wiggles out of their system, but it's not a Christian worldview that this is based on. Just make sure that when we're addressing a problem, we don't create bigger ones.
And to that, Peter?
Yeah, I'll just add two quick things. So in the Bible, there are, and a lot of people struggle with this, the Bible presents ideals, but within every ideal, there are exceptions. So for instance, a very common one that is misquoted is in Proverbs, it says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's an ideal. If I parent my child correctly, they will learn the correct lessons, and if they learn the correct lessons, they'll live the correct way. That's the ideal. Now, there are exceptions to that ideal. I could raise my child perfectly, and they could learn all the right lessons, and they could rebel against all the right lessons. That doesn't disprove that passage. It just suggests that there are exceptions to every rule. Ideally, within the Bible, people get married, right? That's the ideal. That's not always the real, though. That's not always what happens due to various circumstances. And if you read all of 1 Corinthians 7, Paul does mention a present distress that is encouraging him to write the way that he is. So he's not saying that these are ideal circumstances and that's why I'm telling you to do this. He's saying these are unideal circumstances, and therefore that changes the dynamics of what the ideal should be. Now, it doesn't change his message, as Sean put it so well. The primary message is learning how to be content no matter what your state is. Yeah. So I would be very weary of Christians who make it sound like singleness is an ideal. It's not. It's an unideal situation that might be necessary for unideal situations. So we have to be very careful about that. The ideal is to be married, right? It is the covenant that God loves. That's what God wants us to do. That's part of the lives that we're supposed to lead. Doesn't always happen, and there are various reasons as to why, and there's consolation for that, but there is an ideal. Much like the ideal of being in marriage is to have kids. Doesn't always work that way, right? There are things that preclude you from doing it. But that's the ideal. That's what should happen within a marriage. And so we have to be very careful to not throw out the ideal in order to glorify the exception. But we also need to be very careful not to denigrate the exception as though it's not valid. And both mistakes can happen on different realms of Christianity. The other thing that I'll point out is I've never heard of this movement, just full disclosure. So I'm just going to take Sean's word for it that it is as he put it. And I have no reason to doubt him. But in what he's talking about, I have seen elements of this creeping up in our culture. And one of the big problems that we get into in our culture is developing resentment based on representatives, right? So I saw that in a lot of my friends, right? So a lot of my friends that were the worst womanizers were the ones that were cheated on at some point. So the friends that were just the most chauvinistic, cruel, and just baseless towards women, just going around having sex with as many women as they could, without a doubt, every single one of them had a person that they loved, that they cared for, and they cheated on them, they did them wrong, they broke up with them, and now all girls are out to get me. And so it's my job to get from them what I want and never give myself to them. And the reverse works as well. If you live your life giving into resentment and demonizing an entire class of people because one person within that class has wronged you, or maybe even multiple people within that class has wronged you, that is the definition of what we call bigotry, right? Assigning to one group the negative qualities of a singular member. That is literally the definition of bigotry. So be very, very careful when you start feeling that way. So if someone comes to me and they says, man, like all the girls today, they're just such a mess. Well, so are you. What do you mean all the girls are a mess? All of them? Have you met all of them? I think my wife's pretty cool. Like that's just not true. Of course there are a lot of good girls out there. And maybe, think about yourself. Would a good girl want you? Given what is going on in your life and given what you're struggling with. And what could you do to be more appealing to the opposite? So instead of being, and that's why they use the term incel, it's derogatory, but it's an involuntary celibate. Someone who, the reason why they're doing this is because they've been shunned from women. And so they're telling themselves in their own head, no, women aren't shunning me, I'm shunning them, right? I'm turning them down, right? That's self-justification, and it's very sad when people resort to that level of self-justification in the face of disappointment. Just understand, perhaps, as Sean said, one of the reasons why you've been let down so much is maybe you haven't met a decent girl, and maybe that has to do with where you spend your time. Maybe that has to do with what you're doing in your life and the kind of person you're becoming. That's also equally probable. But one good thing to do is again, aim at the ideal, but seek contentment in all things, as Sean said. If I aim at the ideal and I say, well, one of the things I'm going to try to do in my life is to ask myself, what kind of a person would I want to end up with? And then what kind of a person would that person want or need or be blessed by? And I'm going to do everything I can to become that kind of a person. I'm going to do everything I can to become that kind of a person. And if I meet someone and it works, great. But if I don't, I'm still content. But it doesn't remove the fact that it is an ideal situation to be in a romantic relationship with someone that you love. And that's what Paul gets at in that passage, as well as 1 Corinthians 6. So that's important to understand.
Yeah.